Gary DePaul with Unlabeled Leadership. Welcome to episode 44. Bob Mosher delivers difficult conversations. A shout out to the listeners from the great state of Texas, specifically from Fort Worth, Austin, Houston, Caparrots Cove, Cypress, McKinney, Garland, Irving, and Mesquite. With that, let's get started. Over the years, I've met a lot of professionals who have made the transition from public school teaching to talent development in corporations. In fact, in episode 43, David Koster made such a transition. Well, here's another person who did it and did it quite successfully, Bob Mosher. Bob is considered one of the leading experts in the field of talent development. He has already received a couple of Lifetime Achievement Awards, but I don't think he's done yet. In fact, I think we'll be experiencing insights from Bob for many decades to come. If you want to get to know Bob some, go to the show notes. In there, I left a link to a video that Bob did, which can also be found on HPT Treasures. And HPT, of course, means Human Performance Technology. Bob is someone you would want to get to know, and it's a pleasure to have him here on the show. Part 1, Delivering the Truth. As professionals move up in the organizations, corporate organizations, they end up doing work that's more strategic and definitely at a higher level, which happens to take them farther away from customers. What could happen is that employees, instead of being people, they become numbers on a spreadsheet. Of course, that's at the extreme, and so do customers, by the way. But effective executives, they have ways of staying in touch with their people and their customers, and they do it through other people. In this story that you're about to hear, Bob shares an experience he had working at his first company out of teaching public school. Here's Bob.
Well, I've been blessed in my life to have been guided by a number of remarkable leaders. Two come to mind that I have stayed with me for most of my professional life as I've been given the opportunity to lead, and lately with my own small company. Early in my career, after I'd been a public school teacher for a number of years, I was pulled into corporate instruction, and corporate L&D and learning is my trade of late and has been for the majority of my career, well over 30 years. And the first company I went to out of public education that was a for-profit was a small, privately owned computer training company in Rochester, New York, where I spent a good part of my life with my family. And it was really my first exposure to corporate, to having a leader. I mean, when I was a school teacher, I had a principal and other things, but frankly, it's a very you kind of run your own room, right? And so on. And so here I was under this remarkable leader who I just so admired and thought he had an MBA in business and such in Rochester, but quite entrepreneurial in his leading. And I just wanted to be like him. I wanted him to like me. I wanted to rise up in that organization and be a great leader like him. And so we had a moment in that journey where, as often happens, it was a difficult one. And he had asked me a question about a colleague and how things were going. And I gave him what I felt was the right answer. A bit later, he called me into his office and he said, here's the thing. He goes, I had you in here a little bit ago and I asked you about so-and-so and how that was going. And you gave me an answer that was wrong and wasn't honest. And I was so taken back, Gary, by that. I was back in my heels because I would do anything in my life not to hurt this person. What he said to me was, if you want to be a leader around here, you're going to have to stop telling me and everyone else what they want to hear. Leaders deliver the hard messages in a caring and empathetic way. That was such a remarkable pivot in my professional career, because until that point, I had this perception that great leaders were loved. and great leaders always knew the right thing to say. And great leaders always took on the brunt of the organization and carried the burden of the bad news, but made everybody feel great and everything look wonderful. What he taught me in that moment was that things aren't great and wonderful all the time, but it also doesn't mean that delivering the hard message has to be hurtful or has to be take a team down or be punitive. It can be the truth is the truth in delivering it in, as he always did, in a objective and caring and empathetic way we always knew where we stood with Barry. We always knew, every employee in that company knew what was going on, good, bad, or indifferent, knew how we were doing, good, bad, or indifferent. But because of that, we came in every day inspired to work hard and enjoy when things were great, but work together when things weren't. It was just really a remarkable pivot in my life in how I viewed leadership.
What I love about that story is this. As someone goes up in the corporate world to higher and higher career levels to more of an executive position, there's a tendency in corporate America in particular to give more of a rosy picture.
Yeah.
Sometimes executives, they don't want to hear the bad news.
Right.
What I love about this story is that he was, in a sense, giving you safety to be able to be truthful and straightforward and not paint a rosier picture than reality. And he wanted the reality.
You couldn't have said it better, Gary. I mean, every employee, because of the authenticity in the way he led, always felt safe there, no matter what the circumstance was, and always felt responsible to say and bring up what needed to be said, but never in a accusatory or hurtful way, but in a way that we all needed to hear and know so that we could grow that company. And it went on to be a remarkably successful company, bought and sold and other things. And as he should, Barry did quite well as a leader of that company. It was all because of the culture of, I love your word, safety and authenticity in all aspects of running a company. He expected that behavior out of the loading dock worker or the C-suite. And more importantly, he modeled it himself as a leader. That changed my trajectory around that thing.
So much of the influence that people have is not necessarily trying to direct influence, but indirectly through, like you were saying, modeling certain behaviors. When we see it and we see how it works for that person, we want to emulate that. And it's like thinking of Bandura, it's vicarious learning. You learn from seeing these types of behavior.
And the leaders I've not respected, if I may, are the ones that said one thing and did another, or the infamous suggestion box that never gets looked at.
Yeah.
Another thing that Barry always taught us was, if you make a promise, you better be ready to carry it through. He was always very careful in what he said and amount of things that he promised, because he knew that the reality was that under promise, over deliver versus do as I say, not as I do. We just all admired him and aspired to be like him. And we all worked hard for him and each other because of that.
Part 2, accepting honest feedback. In my book, 9 Practices of 21st Century Leadership, I talk about 7 principles. One of them is collaborate with others. Within that principle, there's a few leadership beliefs, and one of those beliefs is influence comes from all directions. That means that anyone inside the organization or even outside of the organization can be an influencer. From the lowest entry-level position all the way up to customers, they can all be influencers. In this story, Bob shares a situation in which an employee is able to express, I'll let Bob explain it. Here's Bob.
It actually happened overseas, Gary, when I visited a partner of mine in Europe, and I was privy to a staff meeting. I was sitting there and one of the subordinates brought up a fairly confrontational issue in the meeting. And I was so taken back. They were speaking a language I didn't speak, but I could tell it wasn't they had done some English for my sake since I was in the room. But once it got a bit heated, I think either naturally or decided to go to a more native tongue. I just waited for the hammer to fall on this individual for having challenged in front of everyone else, the leader in the room. The thing ended and I spoke to my colleague after and I said, so what's going to happen to that, person? He said, what do you mean what's going to happen to him? I said, well, I mean, come on, that behavior was probably not appropriate. And he said, well, no, the inappropriate behavior would have been for him not to have said anything. Coming from a U.S. culture and a lot of hierarchical situations like that in management and so on, I just remember coming back thinking that, my gosh, what a refreshing way to look at how an organization should run. It kind of gets back to my first story, frankly, but it's back to that, you hear servant leader thrown around so much, almost.
Oh, yeah.
No. But the reality is that what I saw work remarkably in this situation was that every employee felt responsible for the success of that organization. And again, I kind of back to our first thing, felt safe and actually responsible to do that. And it was irresponsible to not. I just found that so counter to the world I've been a part of here and have appreciated that ever since.
With servant leadership, the question becomes up, do you serve your chain of command or do you serve the company and customers?
Right. Right.
And if you're in charge, if you are at the top, do you serve yourself or do you serve the people that are enabling your customers to be successful, you know?
Yeah, exactly. And it's funny because I've always heard the classic customer comes first motto, right? I run a consulting company and I have been mentored by some remarkable consultants. I've sort of fallen into this industry and I others have a much greater pedigree than I do, who I've been fortunate to work with or under. What I have seen work better is that, I don't think the customer always knows what's best.
Yes.
And they may know what they want, but what they want isn't always what's right and best for them. And not for an organization self-serving in the expense of their customer. But I think when someone comes to us for a service, we have a responsibility to offer the best service that we can. Sometimes that's saying no in a consulting role or redirecting the way an organization is going or a client may want. I think we get this in L&D all the time in that they may think everything's solved by a 5-day class, but that's not the right deliverable all the time. So empowering employees to own what they're good at and do what's right for the customer, I think in the end, you do serve the customer, best and the organization at large.
I'm going to put a reference in the show notes. There's a book by Greeny et al. Called Influencer. And in there, and I'll find the quotation, I'll put it in the notes as well. They comment that most projects fail because the team felt so uncomfortable, unsafe to be able to say to the sponsor, this is not going to work. We put in this effort. We should stop now before it fails, but they're afraid to, and failure happens.
Right. In my earlier days, and again, younger days, and probably naive days, probably a better word, in this business, I kind of maybe not have learned as well as I thought I had from my experience with Barry earlier. But when I've got myself in trouble in my consulting role, it's when I've pretended to know the answer, or at the sake of not wanting to hurt a customer or frankly lose a customer, I've overextended my ability and level of expertise to serve that customer. And again, I hope I never did it maliciously, but you kind of wander into that thing. And the right thing to do sometimes is to walk away at the extreme case, but we're hired by that customer or we deliver that service to the customer because they feel we know what's best and they've signed us on because they feel we can deliver what's best. So sometimes that means guiding them in an area that they don't know best, so that we can do the right thing.
In talent development, I love the example you gave earlier about the 5-day class. And with a customer may be, if you're serving a business and they're hiring you to do training, they may want something like a page turner, web-based training or a 5-day course. And it's not going to change things. I like how you say that you have to discuss with the customer, either at the extreme, walk away, but you don't want to just be compliant and say, okay, I'll give you what you want, but you want to educate the customer as well in those circumstances.
Yeah, I mean, we're the learning professionals, right? And they're not. The irony of the learning industry is everyone's been a learner. So everyone feels that they know what good learning is. In our space, we have to do it. They came into our office because they want an outcome. They want a performance outcome. And they often come in having already pre-prescribed. A dear friend of mine said, I don't go to my doctor and say, I want 5 Advil because my arm hurts. We wouldn't dare walk in. We go there because our arm hurts. We don't know what the prescription is. But people walk into L&D all the time and say, I have a leadership problem, so I'd like 5 days of leadership training, please. And so it's a world we have to guide them back to why they're in our office. But again, I think that's a responsibility, back to my point about everyone owning the success of the organization, is it comes back to, you hire experts because they deliver a service at a certain level, including L&D. And it is our responsibility to move beyond the order taker and be the prescriber. It involves a dialogue that L&D maybe is not used to hosting all the time.
Part 3, hiring and enabling employees. In the third part of Unlabeled Leadership podcast episodes, the guest usually comes out and gives advice on how we can do a better job at leading, or putting it another way, how we can help other people mature and develop their mental, moral qualities, capabilities, and behaviors. We're blessed by having Bob do this, but also do it through 2 stories. And these stories, I think, are well worth hearing. Again, here's Bob.
My greatest advice I would give folks going into leadership or as leaders is some of the best advice I got from another one of my heroes in leadership, and that's my dad. My father ran a not-for-profit for 35 years. When he retired, a parade of people went up, as I knew they would. He was a remarkable man, and he did some remarkable things in our community through a not-for-profit. And so it was just like a parade of nations of people. And it was one remarkable story after another of how my father had touched their lives or what he had done through that organization he ran. And many of them were a part of that organization. He had led them as their leader. And so he gets up last. He's last. Of course, it's, because it's his send off, and he gets up and says, okay, look, here's the thing. It's, these people have really made me sound way more remarkable than I really think I am. He goes, and my formula to this has been very simple. I've always hired people smarter than me and done my best to get out of their way so that they could do what I hired them to do. And instead of leading them, literally, I made my job one of getting everything out of their way so that they could do what they do best and be successful. I think a leader sometimes puts way too much burden on themselves to lead, to be the leader.
Yeah.
And to know everything and have the answer for everything. I mean, you're a good leader. You've hired remarkable people. When you go in each day to do what you do your best to get out of their way. Do your best to guide people, to allow people to do and grow in ways that lets them do remarkable things under your purview. And don't be afraid. My father was also clear about this, is when that sometimes you miss, sometimes you don't, the hire's not right. And that's okay. He took great responsibility in hiring because of this principle he had. So he also always took the responsibility of guiding someone out of his organization if he had misjudged the match. So he fired people, but he always did it under the guise of, you're here because I invited you, not because you demanded the job.
Yeah.
If it's not working out, I think almost every person my dad hired, he let go into another role somewhere else that they were fit for.
Yeah.
Let's relax as a leader, let your people shine, understand where they have obstacles and barriers, and don't be one of them for them.
Exactly.
For them to do what they do best.
It's a good two-parter there, is that hiring people smarter than you is something a lot of people do, but it's insufficient if you're going to make all the decisions for that person and you don't let them, so get out of the way. I would add to that, be there to tackle any barriers that they run into and back them up.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, don't ask your folks every day what they're doing. Ask why they can't get done what they should be getting done.
Exactly.
Right. Those are two different questions. And so one might be a little bit directive or one of oversight. The other one's one of, look, let's discuss how the next day, the next week, the next year, whatever we're trying to go for, you can be insanely successful. It's funny. Another just real quick story, although this didn't happen to me. It's one of my favorite leadership stories told by a gentleman named Lance Secretan, who wrote a wonderful book called Reclaiming Higher Ground. It's one of my all-time favorite leadership books. And in there, he talked about it. One time he ran Manpower. He started and ran the company called many of us know called Manpower. Mm-hmm. And at one point, he had this remarkable SVP of sales. And the SVP of sales came in and he had certain things he had to get done for Lance, operational things, reports, blah, 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 blah. And so Lance would always start the meeting with, you're behind in your reports. I haven't gotten the latest blah, 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 or how come you haven't gotten me these numbers yet? And so and so. And that salesperson, this remarkable salesperson would go, oh, yeah, okay, yeah, that's right. I'll be sure to go back and do that. But here's how we're doing. Here's the numbers. Here's how we're being successful. And as Lance told the story, he said that it kept happening over and over and over again to the point that our sales started going down. And he goes, and finally, one day when the person walked in my office, I said, look, I'm going to hire you an admin that's going to do all your reports for you and all the stuff I dogged you about to get to me because you're a remarkable salesperson and leader and sales leader. My job is to let you do that well, much to the story of my dad. I think sometimes we over-engineer, overcomplicate, and take on too much burden as leaders that just get in our own way from being successful.
That's a good variation of the story of what you were saying before about your father. When someone isn't a good fit, he may have to help them out of the company. This is a good example of a variation of that, where you're not helping the person out of the company, you're helping that person to get rid of the things that they're not good at and enable them to focus on what they're good at.
Right. Well, so much of development plans are, let's talk about what you need to improve on. Let's talk about your gaps. It's not, here are these remarkable things you're tremendous at. And of course, they should be things you need to do your job. But is it really worth having employees spend 80% of their energy on something that's 10% of their job and they're lousy at? Or free them from that 10 or 20%, which they may never be remarkable at, but we can help them in other ways, but accelerate and accentuate the things that they're naturally or could be remarkable at. And I think that's a choice every leader makes. And I think too many of our professional development programs and performance plans pivot on the negative and pivot on these things that are outside of people's true scope. Or if we step back and look at them in the grand scope of what the person should be doing, they're not as monumental or as important as we think they are.
My thanks to Bob Mosher. If you'd like to learn more about Bob, go to the show notes. And if you have a question or a comment, go to unlabeledleadership.com, click the message icon, and you can leave a voicemail up to 1 minute. I'd like to thank those who have donated to the show. Your contributions help pay for the production costs. Lastly, I'd like to thank you for listening to the show. Until next time, lead on.